Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You live your entire life and the lives of your children trapped within a 1,000-acre radius. You do not own the oven you bake your daily bread in. You do not own the mill that grinds your wheat.
Right.
You do not even hold the rights to the wild fish in the stream running behind your house. And the sweat on your brow for 3 to 5 days out of every week belongs entirely to a warlord who lives in the stone house on the hill.
It is a profound restriction of human movement and economic agency, really.
Yeah.
Because for the vast majority of the population during the Middle Ages, the reality of daily existence was not defined by crowns or tournaments.
Yeah. No court intrigue.
None of that. It was defined by dirt, by the heavy plow, and by a very specific, rigid system of agricultural administration known as manorialism.
We spend so much time looking at the high drama of the era. I mean, the throne room and the battlefield always get the attention.
They do.
But to understand how people actually survived, how society functioned for hundreds of years, you have to look down at the ground level. So, for this deep dive, we are going to examine the exact mechanisms of the manor system. We will walk through the fields, look at the legal realities, and really understand the harsh, everyday rules that dictated how land and labor were organized for millions of individuals.
To comprehend the medieval world, you must comprehend the manor. It was the absolute bedrock of the era, the foundational economic and social structure governing every single aspect of survival.
Before we step onto the land itself, though, we need to clear away a major terminological issue, because the word feudalism gets thrown around constantly.
Right, all the time.
It gets used as this catch-all blanket term for literally anything that occurred between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. But looking at the historical literature we are using today, feudalism and manorialism are two distinct systems.
Very distinct.
They operate parallel to one another, but they are absolutely not the same thing.
Making that distinction is essential for you to grasp the period. They existed simultaneously in the same geographical areas, yes, but they applied to entirely different strata of society.
Right.
Feudalism was a highly specific, contractual system of political and military relationships. It functioned exclusively among the nobility.
So we are talking strictly about the overarching political framework there.
Yes. In the feudal structure, a king, holding theoretical ownership of the realm's land, would grant large tracts to his major lords. These tracts were called fiefs.
Okay.
In return for that land, the lord swore homage and fealty to the king. And the core of this contract was military service.
Providing knights.
Exactly. The lord was obligated to provide a specific number of armed, mounted knights to fight for the king upon request. Those lords could then take their large fiefs and subdivide them to lesser nobles or knights under identical terms.
So it is just a chain of military obligations and land grants among the aristocracy.
Right. It never touched the bottom of the social pyramid.
Let me put a factory analogy on the table to separate these two concepts for you. If we view medieval society as a massive manufacturing operation, feudalism is the upper-level administration. It is the system that determines who controls the regions, who holds the overarching authority, and what the high-level contracts look like.
The executives trading regional control for loyalty.
Exactly. Trading control for resources. Manorialism, conversely, is the actual factory floor.
That captures the dynamic accurately.
Manorialism is where the physical production takes place. It dictates how the grain is grown, who performs the grueling physical labor, what the daily rules of the agrarian workplace are, and how those laborers are bound to their tasks. The people working the land, the peasants, are not participating in those high-level administrative contracts at all.
The peasants never swore oaths of fealty to a monarch in exchange for a fief. I mean, they were the labor force intrinsically tied to the land itself.
Just part of the physical property, almost.
Pretty much. Feudalism provided a method of political organization in a decentralized world, but manorialism was the engine of raw survival. It was the localized system governing relations between a specific lord and the laborers on his specific agricultural estate.
Which raises a structural question when you look at it. Why did these two systems need to operate simultaneously?
Well, the necessity stems from the nature of medieval warfare and the complete absence of a functioning currency system.
There's no cash flowing around.
Exactly. Feudalism emerged because monarchs needed to raise heavy cavalry. A fully armored knight, complete with chainmail, weaponry, war horses, and attendants, was an extraordinarily expensive military asset.
Very high overhead.
Yes. And without a centralized tax system to collect coins and pay a standing army, kings had only one currency at their disposal, which was land.
They trade acreage for military force. But, I mean, giving a knight a piece of land does not magically manifest a suit of armor or food for the warhorse.
And that is exactly the problem. A tract of land is entirely worthless if there is no one to cultivate it. The knight or lord holding that fief must extract physical wealth from it to maintain his military status.
Right.
And that is the function of manorialism. The lord channels military service upward to the king through the feudal contract, and he extracts the necessary agricultural wealth downward from the peasantry through the manorial system.
So the peasant with a hoe is the literal economic base supporting the knight with a sword.
Completely.
If the manorial system stops producing food, the entire feudal political structure just collapses immediately.
Without the daily localized extraction of labor and calories, those high-level military contracts simply cannot be fulfilled. The knights would starve.
We really need to figure out where this factory floor actually came from, because it did not just materialize out of thin air in the 9th century. When you dig into the historical records, they push the origins of this system far back into the agrarian reality of the late Roman Empire.
The trajectory begins with the Roman villa system. As the empire expanded, agricultural production shifted toward massive, consolidated estates owned by wealthy patricians. Initially, the labor force driving these villas consisted almost entirely of enslaved people captured during Roman conquests.
Because the constant expansion of the empire guaranteed a steady supply of forced labor. But expansion eventually stops.
It does. When the borders of the empire stabilized and eventually began to retract, the influx of new slaves dried up. The vast agricultural estates faced a severe labor shortage.
So how did they adapt?
To keep the land productive, Roman landowners began altering their labor models. They allocated small plots of land on their estates to former slaves and to previously independent small-scale freeholders who had fallen into debt.
You're just leasing out chunks of the estate.
These laborers were called coloni, or settlers. They became deeply dependent on the wealthy landowner, who was referred to as the senior.
And then the central government makes a permanent legal intervention that effectively creates the blueprint for the medieval serf.
Yes, this is key. During the late 3rd century, the Roman state was experiencing profound economic instability and administrative chaos. The emperors needed to guarantee a predictable food supply for the cities and the legions, and they needed a stable, immobile population to tax.
Because you cannot tax people if you cannot find them.
Exactly. To achieve this, imperial edicts were issued that legally bound all cultivators of the soil to their current plots of land.
They just legislate immobility. A farmer is legally prohibited from moving to another region or seeking a different profession.
And that restriction extended to their descendants. A person born on that land was bound to work that land forever.
Wow. I mean, that is a heavy legal chain.
It is. The edicts did provide a slight concession, though. The landowner was legally barred from evicting these cultivators, meaning the colony had a secure right to remain. However, the landowner now wielded total economic dominance and, increasingly, legal jurisdiction over the people tied to his estate.
So the fundamental components are established right there. You have the large, centralized estate, the dominant lord figure, and a multi-generational labor force anchored to the soil.
The core DNA of the manor.
Then, as we move into the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapses. In the year 476, Germanic groups like the Franks, the Visigoths, and Ostrogoths take control of the Western territories.
Right, but these new rulers were a warrior aristocracy. They did not arrive with new agricultural theories or complex administrative frameworks.
They just wanted the wealth.
Exactly. When they assumed control of a region, they simply appropriated the existing villa system. The estates and the bound cultivators functioned efficiently, so the new Germanic elite just slotted themselves into the position of the Roman senior.
The system persists because it works. But the absolute solidification of manorialism, the factor that really locks it into place across Europe for centuries, occurs due to the extreme violence and instability of the 9th and 10th centuries.
Yes, the brief period of centralization under the Carolingian Empire shatters. Europe experiences a total breakdown of central authority, coinciding with devastating invasions from multiple fronts.
You have Viking fleets attacking from the north, penetrating deep inland via the river systems.
The Magyars launching rapid cavalry raids from the east.
And Saracen forces striking from the Mediterranean.
The physical insecurity was absolute. Trade networks completely disintegrated, urban centers depopulated, commerce ceased to exist in any meaningful way.
It is a dark time.
Very. With no royal army and no state infrastructure, local communities were entirely isolated.
Look at this from the perspective of an independent farmer during this era. Let's say you own a modest family farm. You are free, you have your own crops. Why would you walk up to the local warlord, hand over the deed to your land, and legally bind yourself and your children to his service? Because the records show free people actively surrendering their liberty.
It is a calculated survival mechanism. I mean, think about the reality. You are an independent farmer working your field. You see the dust of a Magyar raiding party or a Viking longship rounding the river bend.
Right.
They will confiscate your harvest, slaughter your livestock, burn your dwelling, and very likely kill you or take your family as captives. And what do you have? You possess an iron scythe and a wooden shield. You have no defensive walls.
You have absolutely zero chance of defending yourself.
But on the elevated ground a few miles away, the local warlord has constructed a fortified stone keep. He has a chainmail hauberk, a trained warhorse, and professional men-at-arms.
He has a military monopoly.
Yes. So you approach him and offer a transaction. You surrender ownership of your land and bind your labor to his estate. In exchange, he guarantees that when the raiders appear, the heavy timber gates of his fortification will open for you and your family.
You are trading your autonomy for physical survival. The threat of violent death forces the free population into the fortified grip of the local lords. That transaction creates the closed loop we are talking about.
Economic localism and sheer terror finalize the creation of the manor.
We really need to understand how this closed loop physically operated. Let's map out the geography of a typical manor, because the historical consensus indicates these estates varied tremendously in size.
Oh, the variations were extreme. A small manor might consist of only 16 hectares, roughly 40 acres, supporting a very small community.
Just a handful of families.
Right. But a massive estate could cover hundreds of hectares, encompassing multiple villages and parishes. Furthermore, the land was not always a single, contiguous block.
It was broken up.
Yes, some manors were fragmented, with parcels of land spread across a region but administered centrally. However, a standard representation of a highly functional manor on arable lands generally comprised around 400 hectares, or 1,000 acres.
We will focus on that 1,000-acre model for clarity. If you walk into the center of this estate, the hub of all authority and industry is the manor house.
Or a castle, if the lord's status and wealth permitted. This structure serves multiple functions simultaneously. It is the private residence of the lord and his family.
Right.
It is the administrative headquarters where the manorial records are kept. And it is the legal center where the manorial court convenes.
And flanking the main residence is the industrial infrastructure. You have the heavy outbuildings, the communal bakery, the massive brew houses, the blacksmith and carpenter workshops, the stables for the draft animals and war horses, and the granaries designed to secure the harvest.
These buildings represent immense capital investment. They are heavily constructed, often stone or thick timber, and situated within a protective enclosure. And positioned just outside this administrative and industrial core is the peasant village.
This is where the labor force lives. The dwellings are clustered tightly together. We are talking about modest structures, typically wattle and daub, which is woven wooden frames, plastered with mud and clay, topped with thatched roofs.
Very basic shelter.
The tight clustering provided a degree of communal safety and maximized the amount of land available for agriculture. And agriculture dictates the layout of the rest of the 400 hectares.
The division of the arable land is meticulously structured. The primary distinction is the domain.
That is a key term.
It is. This is the land reserved exclusively for the lord. Every sheaf of wheat, every vegetable, and every animal raised on the domain belongs directly to the lord's household or is sold for his direct profit.
And the rest of the arable land is allocated to the peasant holdings. But this does not look like the neatly fenced, square family farms we visualize today. They utilized an approach called open field strip farming.
The visual landscape would be striking to us. You have 2 or 3 massive, unfenced fields stretching to the horizon. These fields are subdivided into hundreds of long, narrow strips.
Right.
And a single peasant household did not receive a consolidated block of strips. Their holdings were deliberately scattered. A family might work one strip near the river, another strip on the elevated slope, and a third strip near the forest edge.
That sounds incredibly inefficient. Why force a farmer to walk back and forth across a massive field all day just to tend to different patches of soil?
The inefficiency in travel time was a necessary trade-off for risk mitigation and survival. Soil quality and drainage vary significantly across a 400-hectare expanse.
Sure.
If a family held all their land in a low-lying area, a single heavy spring rain could flood their entire crop, leading to starvation. By scattering the strips, the manor ensured that every household received an equitable distribution of fertile loam, rocky soil, well-drained slopes, and damp depressions.
It is a collective insurance policy against localized crop failure. You spread the risk.
Exactly. Furthermore, the strip layout was dictated by the mechanics of the heavy plow.
Let's delve into the mechanics of that plow, the karuka, because it is a vital piece of technology that dictates the whole social structure. The soil in northern and western Europe is dense, wet, clay-heavy earth. You cannot just drag a sharp stick through it like you can in the dry, sandy soils of the Mediterranean.
A simple scratch plow will merely bounce off northern European clay. To reach the nutrients, you need a heavy-wheeled plow equipped with an iron coulter to slice the turf and a massive wooden moldboard to physically lift and turn the heavy soil over.
And dragging that much weight through dense clay requires immense kinetic energy. A single horse or an ox cannot move it.
It required a team of up to 8 oxen to pull effectively, and very few individual peasants possessed the wealth to own and maintain 8 draft oxen.
That is a massive expense.
So the peasants were forced to pool their livestock. One family provides 2 oxen, another provides 1, another provides the heavy wooden plow frame, and another provides the iron plowshare.
They form a cooperative plowing syndicate. And turning a team of 8 massive beasts of burden around at the end of a furrow is a miserable, time-consuming ordeal.
Precisely why the strips were laid out in long, narrow rectangles. The objective was to drive the plow team forward in a straight line for the maximum possible distance before being forced to execute a turn. The physical limitations of the ox team dictated the geometric layout of the entire landscape.
And they were operating under a very specific planting schedule to prevent the soil from dying. The agricultural records highlight the triennial or 3-field crop rotation.
Extracting nutrients from the same patch of dirt year after year will exhaust the nitrogen levels. If the soil dies, the village starves. The 3-field system was a critical adaptation for long-term survival.
Let it work.
The community divided the total arable land into 3 massive sections. In the first field, they planted the winter crop. Wheat or rye was sown in the autumn, remained dormant through the winter, and was harvested in the early summer.
Okay, and in the second field, they planted the spring crop. Oats, barley, or legumes like peas and beans. These were sown in the spring and harvested in the late summer.
The legumes were particularly important because we now know they actively fix nitrogen back into the soil. The third field was left entirely fallow for the year. Nothing was planted.
They just let the weeds and natural grasses take over.
Yes, and crucially, they turned the village livestock out to graze on that fallow field. The sheep, cattle, and pigs would consume the natural growth and deposit manure directly onto the soil.
Right.
That manure was the only available method to aggressively restore nitrogen and organic matter to the depleted earth. The following year, the rotation shifted. The fallow field received the winter crop, the winter field received the spring crop, and the spring field was left to rest and recover via the livestock.
The manure from the animals is the linchpin of the entire system. Without the animals fertilizing the fallow field, the grain yields collapse, which explains the immense value of the non-arable lands on the manor. Beyond the plowed fields, the estate included common pastures, woodlands, and meadows.
The meadow was arguably the most critical and fiercely protected acreage on the entire manor. The meadow produced the tall grasses that were cut and dried into hay.
Because if you do not have hay, your oxen starve to death in January when the ground is frozen.
If the oxen die, you cannot pull the heavy plow in the spring. If you cannot pull the plow, you cannot plant the grain. The meadow ensured the survival of the draft animals, which ensured the plowing, which ensured the harvest.
The pastures provided grazing for the sheep, which provided wool for clothing, and the pigs, which were foraged in the woodlands. The woodlands also supplied the fundamental building material and the only source of heat. But the peasants did not have free rein over these common areas. The physical environment was legally codified and heavily policed.
Very heavily. The custom of the manor strictly regulated access. Peasants held defined rights of usage. They might be permitted to gather fallen branches for hearth fuel or harvest a specific quota of timber to repair a collapsed roof. They could turn a specific number of pigs into the forest to eat acorns.
But the boundaries of those rights were absolute. The lord maintained an iron grip over the high-value assets within the environment.
The wildlife, for instance, belonged entirely to the lord. A peasant possessed no legal right to hunt deer or boar in the forest, nor could they extract fish from the rivers or ponds.
If a peasant family is starving following a poor harvest, and the father takes a snare into the woods to catch a rabbit, he is committing a severe crime against the lord's property. The punishments recorded for poaching were brutal.
The rigid control over resources underscores the inescapable reality of manorial life, which is total self-sufficiency. You have to place this system back into the context of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries.
Right.
The Roman road networks had degraded into rutted, impassable mud during the winter and spring. Constant localized warfare made travel lethal. Currency was incredibly scarce.
A manor could not import its survival. If the community needed iron tools, the local blacksmith had to forge them. If they needed leather harnesses for the oxen, they had to tan the hides locally.
Exactly.
If they needed linen for clothing, they had to cultivate the flax, spin the thread, and weave the cloth on site. If a specific resource was not generated within the borders of the estate, the population went without it.
The manor was a closed, self-sustaining organism.
Think about the psychological parameters of that existence for a moment. You were born in a wattle and daub hut. Your daily commute consists of walking to a scattered strip of land to wrestle a heavy wooden plow through clay.
Day in and day out.
You gather your allotted firewood from a specific section of the woods. You have no legal right to leave the estate, and even if you did, the world beyond the tree line is violent and devoid of economic opportunity. The physical horizon of your entire life and the lives of your ancestors is the exact property line of the Lord's 1,000 acres.
It is a level of geographical confinement and insularity that is difficult for a modern mind to process. The world was small, localized, and entirely dictated by agricultural cycles and manorial law.
So we have the machinery of the manor mapped out. Now we must look at the specific individuals operating this machinery. The social hierarchy was absolute. At the apex is the Lord.
The Lord exercises near total dominance over this microkingdom. He might be a relatively minor knight managing a single estate, or a powerful baron administering a network of manors.
Depending on his rank.
Right. But regardless of his broader feudal standing, within the borders of his specific seigneury, his word is paramount. He occupies 3 distinct roles simultaneously. He is the ruler holding judicial authority. He is the primary employer demanding physical labor. And he acts as a paternalistic figure managing the lives of his dependents.
However, the Lord is not standing in the mud in April instructing the peasants on how deep to set the plowshare. He is not auditing the sheaves of wheat in the granary. That administrative burden falls to the middle management, which is the bailiff, sometimes referred to as the steward.
The bailiff is the operational linchpin. This individual was typically a freeman. He did not possess noble blood, but he was elevated above the status of a peasant.
Right.
He operated in the crucial space between the aristocracy and the agricultural workforce. His mandate was to execute the daily economic and agricultural management of the estate on the Lord's behalf.
He is the enforcer and the accountant.
He determines when the triennial rotation shifts. He ensures the seed grain is properly secured and rationed. He oversees the maintenance of the draft animals.
That is a lot of responsibility.
It is, and most critically, he is responsible for ensuring that the peasantry performs their mandatory labor quotas on the Lord's domain. The bailiff maintains the manorial rolls, the physical parchment documents, recording every customary obligation, every debt, and every infraction committed by the workforce.
Beneath the bailiff, forming the massive foundation of this hierarchy, are the serfs. Now, the term serf becomes ubiquitous as we move into the 10th and 11th centuries. I want to challenge this concept directly, looking at our sources. If a human being is legally bound to the soil, unable to leave, and forced to work under threat of punishment, how is that not simply a rebranding of Roman chattel slavery? Is serfdom just a polite semantic shift?
It is a necessary question, but the legal and social distinctions are quite real, even though the deprivation of liberty is severe. Serfdom was categorically different from ancient chattel slavery.
How so?
A serf was indeed bound to the glebe, which is the land. They could not permanently depart the manor, seek alternative employment in a town, or relocate without the explicit, documented consent of the lord.
Right.
They were also generally prohibited from marrying a serf from a neighboring manor without paying a heavy fine, known as a merchant, because the lord refused to lose the future labor of any potential children from that union.
They are biologically and geographically locked down. So where does the distinction from slavery arise?
The distinction lies in their customary rights regarding the land and the integrity of the family unit. A serf possessed a recognized hereditary right to cultivate their specific strips of land in the open fields.
Okay.
The lord could not arbitrarily evict a serf from their holding as long as the serf fulfilled their customary labor obligations. Furthermore, the human being was not a separate commodity from the land.
So the lord cannot sell the person.
A lord could absolutely sell or transfer the entire manor to another noble, but he could not detach the serfs and sell them individually at an auction. If the title to the land changes hands, the serfs remain in situ. They go with the soil.
So a lord cannot separate a husband from a wife or a parent from a child and ship them across the continent for profit.
That is the critical divergence. In ancient antiquity, chattel slaves lived under the constant, horrific threat of family separation and relocation. Serfs possessed a geographical permanence.
Right, they are anchored.
This legal reality slowly homogenized two distinct groups over the centuries: the descendants of the remaining bonded slaves from the Roman era and the descendants of the free peasant laborers who traded their liberty for physical protection from Vikings and Magyars, all merged into a single, massive peasant class holding established, though highly restrictive, rights.
They possess the right to remain on the land and the right to keep their families intact. But the purchase price for those rights is staggering. The economics of survival on a manor were intensely extractive. The primary currency exchanged was not silver or copper, it was sheer human exhaustion.
The economic engine of the manor was corvée labor. This defines the unpaid, mandatory physical work the peasants were legally required to execute on the lord's personal land, the domain.
The ledgers indicate the overwhelming volume of this obligation. This was not an occasional afternoon of helping out.
No, not at all.
A serf's primary occupation was working for someone else. They might owe 3, 4, or in harsh jurisdictions, 5 full days of labor every single week, exclusively dedicated to the lord's fields. They only retained the remaining days of the week to cultivate their own scattered strips to feed their own families.
And the demands escalated during the critical agricultural windows. During the brief, frantic weeks of the spring planting or the desperate race of the autumn harvest, the standard corvée labor was insufficient.
The lord needed more.
Yes, the lord possessed the right to enforce boon work.
Extra, mandatory days of labor.
The lord's survival and profit margins depended on his crops. Therefore, the domain was plowed first, the domain was planted first, and the domain was harvested first.
Even if the peasants' crops are at risk.
Especially then. If a heavy autumn storm was visible on the horizon, threatening to destroy the mature grain, the bailiff would force every peasant into the lord's fields to secure the lord's harvest. Even while the peasants' own grain, the food meant to sustain their children through the winter, was left to rot under the rain in the open strips.
The economic extraction is absolute. It reminds me of the most extreme historical examples of isolated mining towns, an environment where the central company owns the housing, owns the general store, owns the tools, and uses strict monopolies to extract every ounce of value from the worker, ensuring the worker can never accumulate enough capital to alter their situation.
The historical reality of manorial monopolies aligns perfectly with that factory town comparison. In manorial law, these monopolies were known as banalities.
Banality.
Yes. The lord leveraged his capital to build the heavy infrastructure of the estate and then utilized his legal authority to enforce its use.
The banalities are where the control feels really suffocating. The lord finances the construction of a grist mill along the river. He finances the construction of a massive stone bakehouse. If the region produces grapes or apples, he builds the heavy wooden wine press or cider press, and then he legally outlaws any alternative.
A serf was strictly prohibited from grinding their own wheat into flour at home.
You cannot just use a small stone hand mill in your own hut.
If the bailiff discovered a hand mill in a peasant dwelling, it was a severe crime. The mill would be smashed, and the peasant would be heavily fined in the manorial court.
They force you to use their mill.
Exactly. Once a peasant harvested their grain, they were legally compelled to haul it to the lord's watermill. The miller, an employee or leaseholder of the lord, would grind the grain and extract a mandatory toll, often called a multure, which was a direct percentage of the flour.
You lose a portion of your caloric yield just to make it edible, and the process repeats with the oven.
A wattle and daub hut cannot safely contain a high-temperature baking oven without burning down. The peasant had to carry their processed dough to the lord's communal bakehouse. The baker charged a fee, usually a portion of the bread, for the right to use the heat.
The infrastructure is entirely weaponized as a system of taxation, and the direct financial extraction does not end with the bread and the flour. The records show a relentless series of fees. There's the annual head tax.
often recorded as the chevage. It was a flat fee paid annually simply in recognition of a serf's unfree status and their residence on the lord's land.
But the extraction mechanism that seems the most devastating when reading the sources is the inheritance tax. When a serf dies, the lord extracts a toll called a heriot.
The heriot is a stark example of the power imbalance. When the male head of a peasant household died, the right to continue cultivating those land strips passed to his heir.
Right, because it is hereditary.
Yes. But before the heir could legally take possession of the family strips, the lord had the right to claim the heriot. This was not a percentage of a monetary estate. The heriot gave the lord the right to confiscate the absolute best beast owned by the deceased peasant.
The family is grieving, they have just lost their primary source of physical labor, and the bailiff arrives to take away their strongest ox or their most productive dairy cow. It is a staggering economic blow delivered at the moment of maximum vulnerability.
It could ruin a family.
And if a serf died entirely without heirs, the land strips reverted entirely back to the lord's control.
Alongside the labor, the banalities, and the lord's taxes, we must factor in the church. The peasantry was obligated to pay the tithe,
A flat 10% tax on biological output.
a tenth of the harvested grain, a tenth of the sheared wool, a tenth of the eggs produced, and a tenth of the livestock born that calendar year had to be surrendered to the local parish church.
That is immense.
When you calculate the cumulative burden, the corvée labor, the mill tolls, the oven fees, the chevage, the heriot, and the tithe, the margin of survival for a peasant household was razor thin. A single bad harvest, a single outbreak of disease among the oxen pushed the community immediately into famine conditions.
With pressure that intense, with an economic system designed to extract everything just short of starvation, how does the system maintain stability? I mean, without a centralized police force, how does a lord living on a hill prevent hundreds of exploited laborers from burning down the manor house in the middle of the night? How is order actually maintained?
The primary mechanism for maintaining order and resolving the inevitable daily frictions was the manorial court. Because the royal courts were weak or non-existent, legal administration was entirely localized.
It all happened right there.
Yes, the lord or his bailiff convened regular court sessions, typically every few weeks, right there on the estate.
Let's examine a typical court day, because it was the central civic event of the community. Attendance for unfree peasants was legally mandatory. You assemble the entire village, likely in the great hall of the manor house or outside in a designated courtyard. The bailiff is seated at a table with the parchment rolls, ink, and quill, and the population steps forward to air out the granular conflicts of agricultural life.
The court possessed jurisdiction over minor offenses and the regulation of the agrarian economy.
You would hear intense disputes over soil. Someone allowed their plow team to drift 6 inches into their neighbor's strip, or a shepherd fell asleep and allowed a flock of sheep to trample a patch of young spring oats.
Or labor disputes.
Right, you would hear indictments from the bailiff. A specific family failed to provide their mandatory 2 days of boon work during the harvest, or a woman was caught gathering green timber from the forest instead of deadwood, or a man was caught operating a concealed hand mill.
The court managed petty theft, physical assaults between villagers, and the complex logistics of the three-field rotation. But the foundation of the legal decisions in this environment is really quite fascinating. They were not consulting a massive book of national statutes written by a king.
They are enforcing the custom of the seigneury.
The law was entirely customary. It consisted of the unwritten rules, traditions, and precedents that had governed that specific community for generations.
It was hyper-local.
Entirely. The definition of a crime and the corresponding punishment on one manor might be handled entirely differently on an estate situated just 10 miles away.
But the judicial process was not entirely dictatorial. The lord or bailiff is presiding. But the records indicate that the peasantry actively participated in the legal process.
They were integral to it. While the lord held ultimate coercive power and some high nobles possessed the right of pit and gallows, meaning the authority to execute thieves, the day-to-day administration of justice relied heavily on the community.
How did that work in practice?
The custom of the manor lived in the collective memory of the peasants. If a boundary dispute arose, the court did not consult a surveyor's map. They called upon a jury of the oldest, most experienced men in the village to testify under oath as to where the boundary stone had rested during the time of their grandfathers.
It was a localized, peer-driven mechanism for establishing facts. A jury of serfs effectively determining the nuances of local law.
The lords realized that incorporating the peasants into the judicial process reduced resentment. The community regulated its own behavior, enforcing the agricultural schedules against their peers, while the lord extracted financial fines from every guilty verdict.
The fines feed the lord, the peer jury diffuses the anger, and the geographical boundaries of the 400 hectares remain intact. It is an incredibly resilient closed loop. It organized human survival through centuries of systemic chaos.
It provided stability when there was no other alternative.
Yet we do not live in manors today. The system eventually breaks. As we move into the 13th and 14th centuries, this monolithic structure begins to fracture. If the local warlords control all the arable land, hold all the military force, and preside over the only legal courts, what forces could possibly dismantle that architecture?
The dissolution of manorialism was not triggered by a single event. It was a slow, multi-factor collapse, driven by shifting economic, demographic, and political currents.
So it was a gradual erosion.
Yes, the initial foundational crack in the system was the gradual resurgence of a market economy.
The isolation of the manor finally ends.
Over centuries, relative political stability began to return to certain regions. Trade routes became safer. Roads were slowly improved or reestablished. Markets and regional fairs began to reappear. This reintroduction of commerce fundamentally altered the economic calculation for the peasantry.
Because for centuries, a surplus was useless. If you somehow managed to grow extra wheat, you just ate it, or it rotted. But once a market exists 10 miles away, a surplus becomes capital. You can load that extra grain onto a cart, take it to the market, and exchange it for actual silver coins.
Currency re-enters the localized economy, and once a serf acquires hard currency, they possess leverage. They began utilizing that silver to negotiate with their lords, literally purchasing specific freedoms and exemptions from their customary obligations.
And the lords are surprisingly willing to accept these buyouts. Why surrender the physical labor? Because the lords are increasingly desperate for cash themselves. The expanding trade routes are bringing in high-status luxury goods, spices from the East, high-quality silks, intricate plate armor, fine wines.
They need liquid wealth.
Exactly. You cannot buy plate armor with sheaves of raw oats. You need silver.
The aristocracy's desire for liquid wealth led to a massive process called commutation. Lords systematically agreed to commute or convert the mandatory corvée labor services into fixed annual cash rents.
So labor turns into rent.
Instead of forcing a peasant to work 3 days a week on the domain, the lord accepts a set amount of silver per year. The peasant works their own strips full-time to generate that silver.
And what does the lord do for labor on the domain then?
The lord takes that silver and hires agricultural wage laborers to work the domain.
Ah, paid workers.
The administrative reality was that a hired worker, paid a daily wage and facing the threat of termination, was often significantly more productive and easier to manage than a sullen serf performing forced labor under the threat of the whip.
The iron chains of forced labor are slowly dissolving into financial rent contracts. That is the economic shift. What is the demographic shift?
The reemergence of urban centers. As the market economy expanded, small trading hubs swelled into actual towns and eventually cities.
Right, urbanization.
These urban environments were legally distinct. They operated under royal charters and sat completely outside the jurisdiction of the manorial lords. They birthed a new social class, the bourgeoisie, the merchants, the specialized artisans who did not fit anywhere within the traditional lord and peasant hierarchy.
The towns created a geographical escape hatch. The famous medieval German proverb states, "City air makes you free." If a bound serf managed to slip away from the manor in the dead of night, navigate to a chartered town, and reside within its walls for a year and a day without being apprehended by the bailiff, their serfdom was legally nullified. They became a free citizen of the town.
The towns acted as a continuous drain on the manorial labor pool. A lord who was too oppressive risked losing his workforce to the urban centers, forcing him to offer better conditions to retain his laborers.
So we have the slow burn of currency and urbanization, and alongside that, you have a political shift. Kings are getting stronger.
The consolidation of royal authority deeply undermined the local lords' power. As monarchs stabilized their realms, they began constructing professional bureaucracies and standardized royal court systems.
They start pulling legal jurisdiction away from the local manor house.
Exactly. Kings actively encouraged subjects to bring their grievances to the royal courts, superseding the localized custom of the seigneury. For peasants who could manage to pool enough resources to pay the royal filing fees, the king's court offered a way to bypass the absolute authority of their local lord.
It dilutes the Lord's power.
It slowly dismantled the Lord's monopoly on justice.
We have markets, towns, and kings slowly eroding the foundation. But the definitive hammer blow, the event that brutally accelerates the end of the system in the later Middle Ages, is purely biological.
The arrival of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death.
In the mid-14th century, the plague arrives in Europe and triggers a demographic catastrophe. The mortality rates are staggering. Over the span of roughly 5 years, 30 to 50% of the entire European population simply perishes.
The psychological trauma is unimaginable, but the macroeconomic impact on manorialism was immediate and structural. It completely inverted the fundamental dynamic of the agricultural economy.
How so?
Prior to the 14th century, land was relatively scarce due to population growth, and human labor was overwhelmingly abundant. If a serf complained about the corvée labor, the lord could ignore them, knowing there were a dozen landless laborers desperate to take over that strip of soil.
But after the plague sweeps through, that ratio flips overnight.
Suddenly the land is abundant, entire villages are empty, but labor is critically, desperately scarce.
A lord steps out of his manor house in late summer. He has hundreds of acres of ripe grain in the domain, but his bailiff tells him half the village is dead. If that grain is not harvested, the lord's entire economic base collapses. And the surviving peasants look at the rotting grain, look at the desperate lord, and realize the power dynamic has reversed.
The workers suddenly held the leverage. To keep their estates functioning, lords were forced into fierce competition for the surviving laborers. They had to offer unprecedented concessions, official franchises, total freedom of movement, massive reductions in rent, and highly competitive daily wages.
You see historical records of lords trying to pass emergency legislation, trying to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels, and physically force peasants to stay put.
But the macroeconomic forces were too powerful for local laws to contain. If a lord refused to pay a high silver wage, the peasant would simply pack their belongings and walk 10 miles down the road to a neighboring lord who was staring at an unharvested field and was desperate enough to pay the premium in cash, asking no questions about where the peasant came from.
The biological shock of the Black Death effectively severs the tie between the human being and the soil. The economic leverage moved into the hands of the worker, fundamentally ending the classic model of serfdom in many regions.
The transition toward a system of free wage labor and tenant farming became irreversible.
Which leads us to the long tail of manorialism. Because this system did not just evaporate universally in the year 1350, the timeline of its collapse is wildly uneven depending on where you look on the map.
The geography of the decline is stark. In England, the transformation was relatively rapid. By the 16th century, the legal status of the bound serf was essentially extinct.
So what did it look like instead?
The landscape transitioned into a system dominated by yeoman freeholders, independent farmers who fully owned their acreage, and leaseholders who paid straightforward cash rents. The great aristocratic estates still existed, but they were cultivated almost entirely by legally free, hired wage laborers.
The social hierarchy remains. The lords still have the wealth, but the legal chains binding the work into the dirt are gone. But if we shift our focus eastward to the continent, the legal framework of the manor proves incredibly stubborn.
The persistence of the seigneury in Europe is remarkable. In France, despite centuries of economic evolution, the legal remnants of manorial obligations, the localized taxes and monopolies, were not officially and entirely abolished until the eruption of the French Revolution in 1789.
1789.
Yeah.
That date is arresting. The United States is ratifying its constitution, the Industrial Revolution is beginning to stir, and France is only just legally dismantling the medieval requirement that a peasant must use the lord's oven.
And as you move further east, the timeline stretches even longer. Within the vast territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the legal structures of manorialism and formal serfdom were not dismantled until the political revolutions of 1848.
1848. Telegraph lines are being laid down.
And the final major bastion was the Russian Empire. The formal emancipation of the Russian serfs, the severing of the legal bond between millions of peasants and the estates of the nobility, did not occur until the decree of 1861.
1861. Abraham Lincoln is president. The American Civil War is beginning. That is how long the echo of the Roman villa and the fortified medieval warlord endured in Eastern Europe.
When we evaluate the centuries during which manorialism dominated the human experience, its historical function becomes clear. First, it provided an incredibly resilient, self-sustaining method for organizing a hyper-local society during an era of extreme political decentralization and physical peril. It ensured that calories were produced and humans survived when state protection and complex trade networks had entirely evaporated.
It was a brutal mechanism for keeping the lights on during the darkest centuries.
Second, over the long arc of history, it facilitated a crucial legal transformation. It took the enslaved populations of antiquity, merged them with desperate free laborers, and eventually forged a massive peasant class that possessed recognized customary rights to the land they worked.
Right, they had a claim to the land.
It was a harsh, extractive environment, but it established the legal groundwork for the gradual acquisition of full economic freedom by the end of the era.
It is an immense trajectory when you look at it. We moved from the Roman slave tied to the villa to the medieval serf trading autonomy for the safety of a warlord's walls, to the demographic shock of the plague flipping the economic leverage, all the way to the eventual rise of the independent wage earner.
If you really want to perceive the enduring legacy of this massive structure, just look at the physical geography of Europe today. When you travel through thousands of rural European municipalities, their layout is not a modern coincidence. The location of the central grand house or municipal building, the tightly clustered historic dwellings of the village core, the radiating roads leading out toward the agricultural zones, that physical footprint was drawn 1,000 years ago.
The legal framework of serfdom has vanished, but the ghosts of the manor system remain permanently etched into the landscape.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.